Yeah, it's just really interesting hearing you talk about kind of some of the structure around it and the payouts and all that stuff. Because it's like when you think of like right now, ultra running feels big relative to how like any other point in my life, certainly. And it's hard to imagine a sport like this being like actually probably much bigger, over 100
Oh,
years ago. Like,
much.
yeah, no race is paying $500,000 out to its winners at this point, and it's growing fast, but it's probably got a long ways to go before you see $500,000 payouts in ultra running. But if ever, who knows? But that's pretty incredible, and it sounds like a lot of it's based around just like the amount of entertainment they were able to build around it, and then maybe to some degree the lack of other opportunities too, where now we have so many recreational and distractions that you can kind of engage your intention towards. Whereas back then, you hear about a bunch of guys and gals getting into what eventually became Madison Square Garden, and you get all the flair of betting and watching these little prop bets and things like that. You can understand why that got kind of some energy behind it.
Yeah, and they tried to make them the really successful ones where they really drew in tens of thousands of people is they'd have all these sideshows going on too.
Hmm.
If you can picture in the middle of the loop. Yeah, so Madison Square Garden had a track that was eight laps to a mile. And so then inside that, a lot of times they would have other things going on. They'd have shooting galleries.
Yeah.
They would have, I mean, just all kind of these kind of circus things going on. And of course, drinking was just huge. They would have these bars with like 60 bartenders just under the grandstands that everybody would get their beers and have a great time. And some of the spectators would even spend all night, the whole week. They would sleep in the chairs. They would call them the loafers. Um, and then the kids who didn't have 50 cents to come in, they would try to break into Madison Square Garden. They'd find all these ways to crawl up into the windows. They would break a window and crawl in and be able to watch their favorite pedestrian because they became very famous. They even had trading cards like baseball cards, and we preserved a lot of those. They're really interesting to see. But yeah, it became the number one spectator sport in America in, I'd say, around 1880, that 1878 to about 1882. It was the heyday. And it by far was the biggest. Other sports to compete with were like boxing, baseball was starting. But you're right. These other sports weren't distractions. The other distractions for them and the people that really hated these 6-day races were the theaters, because
Yeah.
theaters were big. That's where people would go in the evenings to see plays and musicals and all that. And these 6-day races were taking their customers away. And
Amazing.
so eventually there became lots of people who wanted to shut these things down, but they were big. They were really big. I across the years, later this month we'll have a 6-day race. The 6-day races are coming back.
Hmm.
Um, um, they came back in 1980 is when they started, but just in recent years they've started to be a thing, and the world records are starting to be broken again. That these guys set back almost 100 years ago.
Yeah, it's funny to me because like I think of like just when I did my first ultra marathon in 2010 to today, there's sort of like this like moving narrative of like, okay, the 100 mile is that kind of the premier distance for ultra running. It's one where a lot of people kind of attract their attention to. It's a
Right.
one. It's one where, and some of it might just be because, like, if you want to, similar to these guys and gals in the 1800s, like, if you want to make a name for yourself, you go and you do well at Western States or UTMB, which are
Hmm.
kind of like loosely known as 100 mile races. And then you get this conversation around these 200 milers that are starting to pop up more now too. It's like, oh, the sport's transitioning to where now like the 200s are the new 100. And like
Yeah.
when you think about it, like in reality, it's like you just got to go back further, and like we're not actually progressing towards like we're maybe working our way back to where the origins were, if anything.
That's a good thought. Yeah, that is interesting
So we're not
because
as crazy as you think.
no, but what's great is they kept split times, and so the four books that I've most recently have written is the history of the 6 day race, and it's such a fascinating area. Nobody has ever written about them in story form in great detail like this before, and nobody knew there was 500 or more of these races going on. Most of the historians, they talk about a couple dozen, and the big ones in Madison Square Garden, but they were held they were not all over the world, but they were held in America, Canada, Great Britain, and Australia primarily. And but what's nice is they kept split times, and so I've very carefully gone back and tried to collect, the world records and American records that these guys were setting along the way. So, for example, the 100-mile record back then, where people think they were slow. Well, get this: the 100-mile record was 13 hours and 26 minutes, set back in 1882. And that was held by Charles Rowell of Great Britain. And he was one of the fastest runners back then. Other things, the 24 hours, the record was 156 miles, set in 1888. Let's see, 12 hours, 89.8 miles. The 50 miler was 555 back then. So really impressive what they could do. And of course, the 6 day record is just 623.7 miles in 1888 by George Littlewood of England. And that stood until Yanis Kouros finally beat that in the 1980s. And when he beat it, he really didn't believe that there was such a record back there in the 1800s. And I think he got convinced once he did it himself. But that number of miles, and just there's only been a few handfuls of people who've gone past 600 miles in 6 days. So these guys were really impressive, really great.
Mm-hmm.
Hey folks, just a quick reminder that Delta G Ketones is my go-to exogenous ketone source. You can get 20% off at deltagketones.com with promo code BITTER20. Check out my full description of how I use Delta G Ketones at the end of the episode.
Yeah, and I was gonna actually bring that up because is it the 6 day? If you look at just like the evolution of the 6 day world record, there's been on I think the men's and women's side someone who's held it for over 100 years because of that. Like kind of, so that gives you kind of if I had to sum up kind of this whole scenario with like one description, that would be it. Like you just don't have people holding records for that duration of time if it isn't something where like it was really, really popular at one point and then you have a lull and then you have like a small kind of like crawling back towards relevance. But yeah, I mean, imagine that like your world record gets held for your lifetime and then the majority of your children's lifetime.
Well, and there's still some American records that are still held that have never been broken that they did back in the 1800s. Such as the 6 day American record has now been broken. 621.7 miles. Joe Fegis came close to it, but nobody has broken that one. And James Albert was his name. He settled in Atlantic City. In fact, he was one of the great developers of the Atlantic City Boardwalk. He won equivalent of several millions of dollars in his races. And while most of the ultra runners back then just blew all their money, I mean, they lived posh lives in hotels and gambled, and one had multi-million dollars in just one a few weeks, he lost half of his fortune betting on the horses in Paris and England. So that things like that. But this James Albert, he instead used his money to develop Atlantic City, and so he's the American record holder of a lot of the really long, like for 5 days, and some of these other records that nobody's broken yet.